Historical records indicate that accusations of treason in medieval Europe were never confined to the battlefield or the royal court alone. They extended deeply into the domestic and dynastic spheres, where noblewomen, often positioned as instruments of alliance and lineage, could become entangled in the same systems of suspicion and punishment that governed male elites. Their status did not exempt them from prosecution. Rather, it often intensified scrutiny. In societies where lineage determined legitimacy and power flowed through bloodlines, the actions, or perceived disloyalties, of noblewomen carried consequences that reached far beyond the individual. Contemporary legal frameworks reveal that treason was broadly defined, though its interpretation varied across kingdoms and centuries. In England, the Treason Act of 1352 formalized categories of high treason, including acts that threatened the monarch directly or indirectly. While much of the statute focused on male political actors, it also contained provisions specifically targeting women, particularly in cases involving the death of a husband or violations of loyalty tied to marriage and inheritance. Surviving documents suggest that noblewomen accused of treason were often charged not only with political betrayal, but also with moral transgression, blurring the boundaries between legal guilt and perceived social deviance. Chroniclers noted that accusations against noblewomen frequently emerged during periods of instability, succession crises, civil wars, or factional disputes within the aristocracy. In such contexts, the line between justice and political expediency could become indistinct. Noblewomen, by virtue of their familial connections, were uniquely vulnerable. A marriage alliance that once secured peace between rival houses could later be interpreted as a channel of conspiracy. Letters, dowries, and even acts of patronage could be re-examined as evidence of disloyalty. Legal proceedings involving noblewomen were shaped by both their status and their gender. Unlike commoners, they were often tried in higher courts, sometimes under the jurisdiction of the crown itself. However, this elevation did not guarantee fairness. Surviving trial records indicate that proceedings could be swift, particularly when the accused was associated with a disgraced faction. Testimony was often drawn from servants, retainers, or political rivals, and the standards of evidence were inconsistent. Torture, while not universally applied across Europe, was permitted in certain jurisdictions under specific conditions, particularly within inquisitorial systems on the continent. Legal codes of the period reveal that while noble status could sometimes shield an individual from the most physically brutal methods, it did not eliminate the possibility of coercion. The punishments imposed on noblewomen convicted of treason reflected a combination of legal tradition, symbolic messaging, and social norms. Execution methods, for instance, were carefully calibrated to convey both justice and hierarchy. In England, male traitors were subjected to the severe penalty of hanging, drawing, and quartering, a public spectacle designed to demonstrate the consequences of betrayal. For noblewomen, the prescribed method was typically burning at the stake. Historical records indicate that this distinction was not merely procedural but symbolic. Burning was associated with notions of purification and moral transgression, reinforcing the perception that female treason carried an additional layer of dishonor. However, contemporary accounts suggest that in practice, some noblewomen were spared the full brutality of this sentence. In certain cases, the executioner would strangle the condemned before the fire was lit, reducing prolonged suffering. Such variations were not codified but appear in multiple chronicles, indicating an awareness of the tension between legal prescription and social sensibility. Even so, the act remained public, and its visibility served as a warning to others within the aristocracy. Confiscation of property was another central component of the punishment system. Legal codes across medieval Europe consistently emphasized the forfeiture of lands and titles upon conviction for treason. For noblewomen, this often meant the dismantling of entire estates, with repercussions extending to children and dependents. Surviving financial records demonstrate that these confiscations were not merely punitive, but also economically advantageous to the crown. Lands could be redistributed to loyal supporters, reinforcing political alliances while simultaneously erasing the material legacy of the accused. Imprisonment, though less frequently documented than execution, also played a significant role in the treatment of noblewomen accused of treason. Castles and convents served as sites of confinement, each carrying distinct implications. Detention in a castle often indicated ongoing political relevance, as the individual could still be used as leverage in negotiations. Confinement in a convent, by contrast, reflected a different form of resolution, one that removed the woman from secular power structures while preserving a degree of social respectability. Monastic records suggest that such arrangements were sometimes negotiated, particularly when execution risked provoking further unrest. The role of confession in these cases reveals additional complexities. In inquisitorial systems, confession was considered a critical component of legal resolution. Surviving documents suggest that noblewomen, like other accused individuals, were encouraged, sometimes under duress, to admit guilt. These confessions were often framed in terms that aligned with prevailing moral narratives, emphasizing repentance and submission. The language of these documents indicates that the process was not solely about establishing factual guilt, but also about reinforcing social order. Political considerations frequently influenced outcomes. In cases where the accused belonged to a powerful family, negotiations could alter the course of punishment. Chroniclers recorded instances in which sentences were commuted, delayed, or quietly enforced away from public view. Such decisions were rarely arbitrary. They reflected calculations about stability, alliance, and the potential for retaliation. The treatment of noblewomen accused of treason thus cannot be understood in isolation from the broader dynamics of medieval governance. Gender expectations further shaped both accusation and punishment. Medieval legal and cultural frameworks often portrayed women as subordinate, yet morally influential figures within the household. When a noblewoman was accused of treason, this dual perception could intensify the perceived severity of her actions. She was not only seen as betraying political authority, but also as violating the social order that defined her role. Contemporary writings frequently emphasized themes of deception, manipulation, or undue influence, suggesting that accusations were sometimes framed through a lens that conflated political and moral judgment. Surviving correspondence and administrative records indicate that the consequences of such cases extended beyond the immediate moment of punishment. Families associated with the accused could face long-term marginalization, their loyalty questioned for generations. Marriages could be annulled or renegotiated, and children might be disinherited or placed under guardianship aligned with the crown. These measures illustrate how the punishment of noblewomen accused of treason functioned not only as retribution, but also as a mechanism for restructuring power. The variability of these outcomes reflects the decentralized nature of medieval Europe. Different kingdoms and principalities maintained distinct legal traditions, and enforcement could vary widely even within a single realm. However, the underlying patterns remain consistent: accusation, investigation, public or symbolic punishment, and the redistribution of assets. Together, these elements formed a system that addressed both the immediate threat of perceived disloyalty and the longer-term objective of maintaining hierarchical control. Chroniclers and legal commentators of the period rarely questioned the legitimacy of these practices, yet their records provide insight into the tensions inherent within them. The need to balance justice, deterrence, and political stability created a system that was both rigid in its principles and flexible in its application. Noblewomen accused of treason stood at the intersection of these forces, their fates shaped by factors that extended far beyond the charges themselves. Surviving case records indicate that the prosecution of noblewomen for treason often unfolded within a broader climate of political uncertainty, where accusations were closely tied to shifting alliances and contested authority. In such environments, the legal system functioned not only as a mechanism for adjudicating guilt, but also as an instrument through which power could be consolidated. The experiences of noblewomen accused of treason therefore reveal patterns that extend beyond individual cases, illustrating how governance, gender, and dynastic politics intersected in medieval Europe. Contemporary accounts describe how evidence in these trials was frequently circumstantial, relying on correspondence, witness testimony, and inferred intent. Letters exchanged between noble households could be interpreted as signs of conspiracy, particularly when they involved regions or families already under suspicion. Chroniclers noted that the possession of certain documents, or even the absence of expected declarations of loyalty, could be construed as incriminating. In a period when communication itself was a political act, the written word carried significant risk. Noblewomen, often responsible for managing estates and maintaining familial networks during the absence of male relatives, were especially exposed to such scrutiny. The case of Eleanor Cobham illustrates the convergence of political vulnerability and legal prosecution. In the mid-15th century, her association with Humphrey of Lancaster placed her within the inner circle of royal power. When accusations emerged involving necromancy and attempts to predict the death of Henry VI, the charges carried both political and moral weight. Surviving records suggest that the proceedings against her involved a combination of ecclesiastical and secular authorities, reflecting the overlapping jurisdictions that often characterized such cases. Although not executed, she was subjected to public penance and lifelong imprisonment, demonstrating how punishment could be calibrated to achieve both humiliation and containment without resorting to immediate death. Legal codes of the period reveal that accusations of sorcery or witchcraft were not uncommon in cases involving noblewomen, particularly when direct evidence of treason was limited. These charges provided an alternative framework through which perceived threats could be addressed. The association between supernatural practices and political subversion allowed authorities to construct a narrative that justified intervention while reinforcing prevailing moral doctrines. In this context, the boundaries between heresy, sorcery, and treason were often blurred, enabling a broader range of punitive responses. Chroniclers also recorded the case of Anne Boleyn, whose execution in 1536, though slightly beyond the conventional medieval period, reflects continuities in the treatment of noblewomen accused of treason. The charges against her included adultery, incest, and conspiracy against Henry VIII. Surviving trial documents suggest that the evidence presented was contested even at the time, with some accounts indicating that the proceedings were influenced by court factionalism. Her execution by beheading, rather than burning, marked a deviation from earlier norms, reflecting both her status as queen and evolving practices within the Tudor legal system. The case illustrates how the punishment of noblewomen could be adapted to serve immediate political objectives while maintaining the appearance of legal continuity. Imprisonment remained a central tool in managing accusations of treason, particularly when execution posed risks to political stability. The use of fortresses such as the Tower of London provided a controlled environment in which high-status prisoners could be held securely while their cases were negotiated. Administrative records from such institutions reveal detailed provisions for the maintenance of noble prisoners, including allowances for servants, clothing, and religious observance. These accommodations underscore the dual nature of their confinement, restrictive yet still shaped by the expectations of rank. Convents continued to serve as alternative sites of detention, particularly in regions influenced by canon law. Monastic archives suggest that noblewomen placed in religious houses were often required to adopt a form of semi-permanent seclusion, effectively removing them from political life. This practice allowed authorities to neutralize potential threats without provoking the backlash that might accompany execution. It also aligned with broader cultural notions of repentance and withdrawal, framing the outcome as both punitive and corrective. The economic consequences of treason convictions remained significant throughout this period. Royal financial records demonstrate that the confiscation of estates belonging to condemned noblewomen contributed to the redistribution of wealth and the reinforcement of loyalty among supporters of the crown. In some instances, portions of these estates were later restored to family members who demonstrated allegiance, indicating that property could be used as a tool of negotiation as well as punishment. This selective restoration highlights the pragmatic considerations that often guided enforcement, as rulers sought to balance retribution with the need to maintain stable networks of support. Gendered perceptions continued to influence both the framing of accusations and the application of punishment. Contemporary writings frequently portrayed noblewomen as intermediaries within networks of influence, capable of shaping decisions through persuasion rather than direct authority. When accused of treason, this perceived influence could be recast as manipulation or deceit, reinforcing the legitimacy of punitive measures. At the same time, societal expectations regarding femininity and decorum sometimes moderated the severity of punishment, particularly in cases where public execution might be seen as excessively disruptive. The interplay between public spectacle and controlled enforcement is evident in surviving descriptions of punishment rituals. While executions were designed to convey the authority of the state, they were also subject to negotiation and adaptation. In some cases, the visibility of the punishment was reduced, either through the choice of location or the manner in which it was carried out. These decisions reflect an awareness of the potential consequences of public displays, particularly when the condemned belonged to prominent families whose support remained politically valuable. Diplomatic considerations further complicated the treatment of noblewomen accused of treason, especially in cases involving cross-border alliances. Marriages between noble houses often linked different kingdoms, creating situations in which the prosecution of one individual could have international implications. Correspondence between courts indicates that such cases were sometimes addressed through negotiation, with outcomes influenced by the need to preserve diplomatic relationships. This could result in exile, transfer of custody, or other forms of resolution that avoided direct execution. The role of rumor and reputation also emerges as a significant factor in these cases. Chroniclers frequently noted the circulation of allegations prior to formal charges, suggesting that public perception played a role in shaping legal outcomes. Once an accusation of treason was established, it could be difficult to counter, as the stigma associated with disloyalty extended beyond the individual to encompass their entire network. This dynamic underscores the importance of narrative control within medieval governance, where the management of information was closely tied to the exercise of power. Surviving judicial and administrative records reveal that appeals were rare but not entirely absent. In certain instances, petitions for clemency were submitted by family members or allies, emphasizing loyalty and service to the crown. The success of such appeals depended largely on the broader political context, including the stability of the ruling authority and the strength of competing factions. When granted, clemency often came with conditions, such as continued confinement or the forfeiture of specific rights, ensuring that the individual remained under control. Over time, these practices contributed to a body of precedent that influenced subsequent cases. Legal commentators drew upon earlier examples to justify decisions, reinforcing a sense of continuity within the system. At the same time, the adaptability of enforcement allowed for variation in response to changing circumstances. The punishment of noblewomen accused of treason thus reflects a legal culture that was both rooted in tradition and responsive to the demands of governance. The cumulative effect of these processes extended beyond individual outcomes, shaping the structure of aristocratic society. Families affected by accusations of treason were often compelled to renegotiate their position within the hierarchy, seeking to restore trust and secure their future. This could involve strategic marriages, displays of loyalty, or participation in royal campaigns. In this way, the punishment system functioned not only as a means of addressing perceived threats, but also as a mechanism for reinforcing the broader framework of power upon which medieval states depended. Historical records indicate that by the late medieval period, the treatment of noblewomen accused of treason increasingly reflected a more formalized intersection between centralized authority and established legal procedure. While earlier centuries had seen a greater degree of regional variation in enforcement, the gradual consolidation of monarchical power in several European kingdoms led to more standardized approaches. Surviving legal commentaries suggest that rulers became more attentive to the political symbolism of punishment, particularly when dealing with individuals whose status could influence broader networks of loyalty. In England, France, and parts of the Holy Roman Empire, administrative reforms contributed to a more structured judicial environment. Written indictments became more common and record-keeping improved, allowing authorities to draw upon prior cases when determining sentencing. This development did not eliminate discretion, but it created a framework within which decisions could be justified through precedent and legal reasoning. Noblewomen accused of treason were increasingly processed through courts that combined customary law with emerging statutory systems, reflecting a transitional legal landscape. Contemporary accounts describe how interrogation practices, where permitted, were subject to growing regulation. While coercive methods were not uniformly applied across all regions, legal texts from inquisitorial jurisdictions indicate that questioning procedures were formalized to ensure the extraction of confessions under controlled conditions. For noblewomen, however, status often altered the nature of enforcement. Physical coercion was sometimes avoided in favor of psychological pressure, confinement, and the strategic use of family leverage. Authorities recognized that overt brutality against high-ranking individuals could provoke political instability, particularly if their families retained military or financial influence. The case of noblewomen accused during the Wars of the Roses in England illustrates how treason charges were deeply embedded in factional struggle. Chroniclers noted that shifts in royal authority frequently led to retrospective accusations, where previous allegiances were reinterpreted as acts of betrayal. When the House of York and the House of Lancaster alternated in power, noble families associated with the losing side often faced legal scrutiny. Women within these families, especially those managing estates or acting as intermediaries during their husbands' absences, were not exempt from suspicion. Their administrative roles could be reframed as evidence of complicity, particularly when estates were used to support military efforts. In France, similar patterns emerged during periods of internal conflict and external war. Royal correspondence from the 15th century indicates that accusations of treason were sometimes used to dismantle powerful regional networks. Noble women connected to influential provincial families could be targeted as part of broader efforts to assert central authority. In such cases, punishment extended beyond the individual to encompass symbolic acts of dispossession and public correction, reinforcing the supremacy of the crown over regional autonomy. Legal codes of the period reveal that punishment for treason was designed not only to eliminate perceived threats, but also to communicate the boundaries of acceptable political behavior. Execution remained the most severe outcome, but it was no longer the only available resolution. Alternatives such as lifelong imprisonment, forced religious seclusion, or conditional exile became more common in certain jurisdictions. These options allowed rulers to neutralize individuals without necessarily provoking retaliation from powerful kin groups. The role of religious institutions remained significant in shaping outcomes. Ecclesiastical authorities often participated in proceedings involving noble women, particularly when accusations overlapped with moral or doctrinal concerns. Monastic records suggest that confinement within religious houses was frequently presented as an act of penance, aligning punishment with prevailing spiritual frameworks. This arrangement served dual purposes. It removed the individual from secular influence while also reframing their status within a religious narrative of correction and redemption. Economic considerations continued to play a decisive role in shaping enforcement. Royal treasuries benefited substantially from the confiscation of lands and assets associated with convicted individuals. Financial records from several kingdoms demonstrate that these resources were often redistributed strategically to reinforce loyalty among supporters of the ruling authority. However, in some cases, partial restitution was granted, particularly when political reconciliation was deemed necessary. This flexibility underscores the pragmatic dimension of treason enforcement, where economic and political stability often took precedence over rigid application of punishment.